On July 8, 2015, 19-year-old nursing student Stephen Smith was found dead in the middle of a dark, rural highway in South Carolina. The official police narrative was swift, final, and dangerously convenient. Stephen was simply the victim of a tragic, late-night hit and run. But that is a lie. The contrarian truth is that Stephen was brutally beaten to death, dragged into the asphalt, and his body staged to look like a vehicular accident. The proof is undeniable. Despite a gaping 7-inch skull fracture that exposed his brain, there were 0 skid marks on the road, 0 shards of automotive glass, and his loosely tied slip-on shoes were still perfectly on his feet. Today, we are going to expose the impossible geometry of this crime scene, the absurd medical gaslighting by state officials, and the terrifying, untouchable local dynasty the police were desperately trying to protect. Sandy Run Road in Hampton County, South Carolina, is pitch black at 4 in the morning. There are no streetlights, no traffic cameras. It is a ribbon of asphalt cutting through dense pines, the kind of road where secrets are easily swallowed by the dark. At 4 a.m., a passing motorist spotted something obstructing the center of the roadway. It was the body of Stephen Smith. Stephen was a 19-year-old nursing student. He was bright, ambitious, and proudly, openly gay in a conservative Southern community where that alone could make you a target. When first responders arrived, they found Stephen lying precisely in the middle of the lane. His head was severely traumatized. He had a massive, devastating wound on the right side of his skull, a dislocated right shoulder, and cuts on his left hand. Almost immediately, the responding officers from the Hampton County Sheriff's Office began treating the scene like a traffic fatality. They assumed Stephen had run out of gas, started walking home, and was struck by a passing truck or a car whose driver had fallen asleep. It was the path of least resistance. A neat, tidy tragedy that required a cleanup crew, not a homicide unit. But as the sun rose and the South Carolina Highway Patrol's multidisciplinary accident investigation team known as MATE took over the scene, the hit-and-run narrative began to collapse under the weight of basic physics. If a vehicle strikes a human being with enough force to cave in their skull, it leaves a signature. The transfer of kinetic energy is violent and messy, but the investigators looking at Stephen's body found a pristine, impossible vacuum of evidence. There were no skid marks indicating a driver had slammed on their brakes. There were no yaw marks from a sudden swerve. There was no automotive fluid, no shattered headlights, no broken fiberglass, and no paint transfer on Stephen's clothing. But the most damning piece of evidence, the detail that makes the official police narrative an insult to our collective intelligence, was Stephen's shoes. Stephen was wearing loosely tied, slip-on canvas shoes. Anyone who has ever investigated a pedestrian vehicle collision knows that the sheer force of an impact nearly always blows a victim out of their footwear. Yet, Stephen's loosely tied shoes were perfectly intact, still comfortably on his feet. His cell phone and keys were still in his pocket, completely undamaged. Even his placement on the road was wrong. In a high-speed collision, a body is thrown. It rolls into the ditch. It leaves a trail of biological evidence, but Stephen's body was lying longitudinally, almost perfectly parallel to the yellow line, with his head turned, arms resting at his sides. To the seasoned MATE investigators standing on that pavement, the truth was chillingly obvious. Stephen wasn't hit by a car. He was beaten to death somewhere else, transported, and dumped in the middle of the road to disguise a murder. Todd Proctor, a lead investigator for the Highway Patrol, famously stated that there was absolutely no evidence pointing to a vehicular collision. So, with the physical evidence overwhelmingly proving a staged homicide, the investigation should have pivoted immediately. Warrants should have been drafted, timelines established, but this is where the justice system in Hampton County stopped working for Stephen Smith and started working for his killers. The first profound failure of the system came from the medical examiner's office. Dr. Aaron Presnell, a pathologist at the Medical University of South Carolina, conducted Stephen's autopsy. Despite the absolute lack of vehicular debris, despite the untouched phone in his pocket, and despite the Highway Patrol's vehement assertion that no car was involved, Dr. Presnell officially ruled Stephen's death a hit and run. Her reasoning? She theorized that Stephen had been struck in the head by the side mirror of a passing commercial truck. Let's pause and examine the sheer absurdity of this ruling. For a side mirror to inflict a fatal 7-inch skull fracture while leaving the rest of the body entirely untouched The geometry must be flawless. The truck would have to be traveling at high speed, clipping a 5'5" teenager in the head with pinpoint accuracy, without the mirror shattering into 1,000 pieces over the crime scene, and without the massive grille of the truck striking his shoulder, torso, or legs. Furthermore, Dr. Presnell noted that the wound on Stephen's head was a clean, linear laceration. Side mirrors are blunt, rounded plastic objects. They do not cause clean, deep lacerations that look suspiciously like the strike of a baseball bat or a metal pipe. When Highway Patrol investigator Todd Proctor confronted Dr. Presnell about her impossible conclusion, her response was indicative of a broken system. According to Proctor's notes, Dr. Presnell essentially told him it wasn't her job to investigate the scene, and that since he was found in the road, it was a hit and run. She refused to amend the death certificate by labeling the death a vehicular accident. The medical examiner effectively handcuffed the homicide investigation. In South Carolina, a hit and run falls under the jurisdiction of the Highway Patrol. A murder falls under local police and the state law enforcement division, SLED. Because of this medical gaslighting, SLED stepped back. The local sheriff's office washed their hands of it. The case was left in bureaucratic limbo, legally defined as a traffic accident that everyone internally knew was a brutal execution. But why? Why would a medical examiner dig her heels into a scientifically impossible theory? Why would the local sheriff's department be so eager to write off a dead teenager? To understand the cover-up, we have to pivot from the crime scene on Sandy Run Road to the halls of power in Hampton County. We have to look at the systemic rot that allowed a murder to be erased. In Hampton County, power had a name: Murdaugh. For 87 consecutive years, 3 generations of the Murdaugh family served as the 14th Circuit Solicitor, the chief prosecuting agency for a 5-county region. They were the law. They controlled who got charged, who went to prison, and who walked free. Even after they stepped down from the official solicitor role, the Murdaugh family operated a massive, multi-million-dollar private litigation firm. They had judges on speed dial. They had law enforcement eating out of their hands. They were, by every definition of the word, untouchable. And in the investigative files for the murder of Stephen Smith, the name Murdaugh is mentioned over 40 times. From the very first week of the investigation, the Highway Patrol was flooded with tips from the community. Callers were terrified, speaking in hushed tones. But their stories were eerily consistent. They all pointed to the Murdaugh family specifically, the young scion of the Dynasty, Buster Murdaugh, and his younger brother, Paul. Rumors permeated the town that Stephen, who offered tutoring services to local students, had been involved in a secret, intimate relationship with Buster Murdaugh. In the hyper-masculine, deeply conservative world of the Murdaugh family, an openly gay relationship would have been viewed not just as a scandal, but as an existential threat to their carefully curated legacy. Witnesses told investigators that Buster and his friends were seen driving around in a truck, boasting about striking a gay kid with a bat. Another tipster claimed a member of the Murdaugh family had called a massive favor to silence the local police. In any standard, functioning justice system, a family named 40 times in a murder investigation file would be brought into an interrogation room. Their alibis would be aggressively verified. Their vehicles would be seized and subjected to luminol testing for blood evidence. Cell phone tower data would be subpoenaed to track their movements on the night of July 8th. The Hampton County authorities did none of this. Investigators deliberately ignored the glaring neon signs pointing to the local aristocracy. Instead of hauling Buster Murdaugh into an interrogation room, the police actively tiptoed around the family. The investigative notes read like a masterclass in willful blindness. Law enforcement officers were paralyzed by the name. They knew that pulling a Murdaugh into a murder investigation was career suicide. If you went after the kings of Hampton County and missed, your badge, your pension, and your livelihood would be destroyed. So, the system did what it was designed to do. It protected the elite at the expense of the vulnerable. Stephen's mother, Sandy Smith, fought like hell. She wrote letters to the FBI, to the state attorney general, begging them to look at the massive head wound, the pristine shoes, the missing glass. She begged them to look at the Murdaughs. In one heartbreaking letter, Sandy explicitly named Buster Murdaugh and stated that local law enforcement was intentionally looking the other way because they were terrified of the family's influence. The system's response was deafening silence. Sandy Smith was treated as a nuisance, a grieving mother who just couldn't accept that her son was the victim of a random traffic accident. The gaslighting was total and absolute. The case file was shoved into a drawer, the blood on Sandy Run Road was washed away by the rain, and life for the wealthy elite of Hampton County continued undisturbed. Stephen Smith's death became a ghost story, a grim reminder to the working-class citizens of the Lowcountry. There are two tiers of justice. One for the people who work for a living, and one for the people who own the town. If you cross the latter, you can be beaten to death on a highway, and the police will literally forge the physics of the universe to protect your killers. For 6 years, Stephen's killers walked free. They enjoyed their vast estates, their offshore fishing boats, and their political galas, completely insulated by a corrupt law enforcement apparatus that had sold its soul for proximity to power. It wasn't until June of 2021 that the wall of silence finally cracked. But it didn't crack because the police suddenly grew a conscience. It cracked because the Murdaugh empire imploded in spectacular, bloody fashion. When Alex Murdaugh, the patriarch of the family, was accused of executing his own wife, Maggie, and his youngest son, Paul, at their hunting lodge, the national media descended on Hampton County. The spotlight was suddenly too bright. SLED investigators, now under the intense scrutiny of the entire country, began tearing apart the Murdaugh family's dark history. And sitting right there, gathering dust in the archives, was the file of Stephen Smith. Only then, 6 years too late, and only because the Murdaughs had lost their political armor, did the State Law Enforcement Division officially reopen Stephen's case. In March of 2023, SLED Chief Mark Keel finally admitted what Sandy Smith had been screaming into the void for nearly a decade. Stephen Smith's death was a homicide. They exhumed Stephen's body. Independent pathologists conducted a new autopsy, unburdened by the political pressure of the local solicitor's office. The truth, buried under 6 feet of dirt and 6 years of bureaucratic lies, was finally allowed to breathe. It was not a hit and run. It had never been a hit and run. The tragedy of Stephen Smith is not just that a young man with his whole life ahead of him was violently murdered. The true, sickening outrage is the absolute complicity of the very people sworn to find his killers. The investigators who looked at perfectly tied shoes and said car crash. The medical examiner who looked at a blunt force execution and said side mirror. The police chiefs who saw a wealthy dynasty named 40 times in a file and decided to look the other way. They stole Stephen's justice. They forced a mother to endure years of psychological torture, knowing the men who slaughtered her son were buying rounds at the local country club. This case proves that corruption isn't always envelopes of cash passed in dark alleys. Sometimes, it's a medical examiner's signature, a sheriff's deliberate inaction, and a town too terrified to speak the truth. If you thought the cover-up in Hampton County was a sickening display of how wealth dictates the law, wait until you hear how a billionaire used his fortune to manipulate the police, destroy forensic evidence, and walk away clean from a double homicide in his own mansion. Click the video on your screen to see the case they tried to bury forever.